So the Republic Navy famously used the Venator-Class Star Destroyer and the Acclimator-Class assault ship. And while both these vessels are large and imposing, they were often accompanied by a number of smaller vessels. So today we'll take a look at these smaller vessels of the Republic Navy, their purposes, and a little bit on their design. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So I've talked a lot about some of the larger vessels in the Republic Navy, things like Venators and Acclimators, but I have not spent as much time on the smaller vessels that played an equally important role. So I figured today we'll talk about some of the smaller vessels like the Arquitens-Class and the Pelta-Class. So let's start with the largest of these vessels, and that is the Arquitens-Class cruiser, which during the war earned the nickname the Jedi Cruiser. Now, the Arquitens would become more famous later in its history for its service to the Galactic Empire, but it did serve the Republic during the war. Unlike many of the other vessels on this list, it's actually not very specialized. It's basically a smaller version of a Venator. It sported 4 dual light turbo laser turrets, 4 quad laser cannons, and a pair of torpedo tubes. This armament allowed it to be effective against vessels near its own size and even some stuff a little bit larger. A few of these, for example, could easily swarm and overwhelm something like a Munificent-class star frigate. But their main role within the Republic Navy would be supporting larger Republic vessels. These vessels would often find themselves in larger fleets defending things like Venators and Acclimators. One of the most notable uses of an Arquitens-class light cruiser during the Clone Wars would be during the Battle of Seleucami. During the battle, Obi-Wan Kenobi would use an Arquitens-class light cruiser to board General Grievous's Recusant-class destroyer. And by the way, if you want to learn more about the Arquitens-class light cruiser, I did a whole video on it, mainly focusing on its Imperial career, and I'll leave a link up here to that. But the Arquitens wasn't the only small vessel utilized by the Republic, there were several others. The Consular-Class frigates were modified versions of Consular-Class cruisers, which were an older Republic vessel. Before the war, they often filled diplomatic roles, being painted red and very lightly armed. But with the outbreak of hostilities, a lot of these vessels were modified to be Consular-Class frigates. And while frigate is not an accurate name, these realistically should be called corvettes, they were still very useful in combat. These little guys were actually very well armed. They carried 4 heavy laser cannon turrets, a single quad laser cannon turret, and a series of concussion missile launchers. These made them perfect for filling the escort role of a corvette. Basically, they were remarkable at screening against droid starfighters. This allowed them to really fill the role of defending larger Republic ships and other Republic assets. And thanks to these vessels' speed, they were also fairly good transports, being able to transport VIPs over long distances relatively quickly. A lot of features that were still around from its days as a diplomatic transport really came in handy during its wartime service. For example, the entire front segment of the vessel could separate like a large escape pod. This greatly improved the crew's survivability rate within combat. Ultimately, though, these would not be used as much as the Arquitens, and they wouldn't be a very common sight during the war. But there's one more vessel that we need to discuss, and that is the Pelta-Class frigate. Now, during the Clone Wars TV show, the Pelta-Class frigate gets a little bit of a reputation for being a medical frigate. We see it used in a lot of occasions to transport casualties to and from a battle, and we often see it docking with Haven-class medical stations, which, by the way, have docking ports specifically designed to accommodate the Pelta-Class. But the Pelta-Class actually does have a combat variant. While the medical frigate version did have a few laser cannons to defend itself, the versions intended for combat would add to that a few turbo laser turrets and some tractor beams. This allowed it to be fairly useful on its own. And its relatively large size, being a little bit larger than an Arquitens-class light cruiser, made it actually kind of imposing in combat. It could outsize some smaller vessels and would ultimately be a threat against specialized vessels like bounty hunter ships and small freighters. Still, its most famous role was as a medical vessel. These vessels found a nice little niche being able to transport casualties to and from the battlefield, and many of them were modified to be able to treat the wounded on board while they were being taken to a proper medical facility. So in the TV show, most of the places that we see this vessel, they are serving as medical frigates. And it is notable that at least one Pelta did see service after the end of the war, serving as Phoenix home for the Phoenix Squadron of Rebels during the early days of the Rebel Alliance. So, while in many battles the Venator-Class Star Destroyers really claimed the spotlight, they weren't alone, and they had a lot of smaller vessels serving under them. A lot of these vessels are actually holdovers from the days before the war and were serving the Republic Navy before the outbreak of hostilities. If you want to learn more about how the Republic Navy worked before the Clone Wars, I'll leave a link up here to my video on vessels that the Republic Navy was using before the outbreak of the war. And I want you to let me know down in the comments which of these vessels you'd prefer to command if you had to command one of them. Would you like to use something more combat-based like an Arquitens-Class light cruiser, or would you prefer to be in command of something with more of a logistic role like the Pelta-Class frigate? And last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.